Welcome to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of CEN. Today, we're going to hear from Kimberly Carfore about ecological self. But first, a little bit about Kimberly. Kimberly Carfore, PhD, teaches in both the environmental studies and religion and theology programs at the University of San Francisco. She received her PhD in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. The concepts she developed in her dissertation, Encountering the Wild, Recovering an Ecological Self, were embodied and inspired by her time working as a wilderness therapy field instructor, where she spent 336 days living in the wild. Wow. She has published numerous articles in the Journal of Ecopsychology and the Trumpeter, and chapters including Doing Theology with Snakes in Encountering Earth. Thank you for joining us today, Kimberly. I'm so looking forward to this presentation. The airwaves are yours.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you to Carol for inviting me. And thanks to the Ecopsychology Network, the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, for the work that you do. I'm very honored to be here. I also want to acknowledge some of the support that I have. Well, of course, my mother is on right now. Thank you, Linda. And also some of this Earth others that are here right now. I'm in my backyard, and so there's the hummingbird, we have the California gray squirrel, chipping sparrow makes its appearance every once in a while. I also have the western scrub jay, shows itself a lot, and my domestic feline friend, Mrs., who may also make an appearance. So the title of my talk is Recovering an Ecological Self. And so I use the word recover because our ecological selves are always within us. It lies latent. And so the work is to recover it. It's not to create something new. So where I gain inspiration is through the work of Brian Thomas Swim and Thomas Berry through their evolutionary framework, where humans are embedded within this multi-species kinship, this evolutionary strand from like fish, reptiles, mammals, primates, and then humans. So we're not separate from the natural world in this way. We have evolved out of the natural world. So it's a remembering, it's a recalling. And so I use the word ecological self because I want to conjure this image of a permeability with the natural world, this sense of porosity and connection. And so when I think about pores, I think of membranes, you think of cells, even cells have membranes, our skin is porous. And so in that way, I think porosity helps us conjure an image of what it is that I'm trying to bring back or recover. And so our ecological identities, when I think of identity, I think of I am, using the phrase I am. And a lot of the times I am, we think of human constructs, like I am a daughter, I am a friend, I am a teacher. But also I like to step outside of that, like I am a mammal, I am an evolved primate. And so to move, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the work of Alan Watts. So he uses the word a skin encapsulated ego. So to try to understand ourselves outside of this framework, that our porosity is embedded in the natural world, not just extends to the end of our skin. And so in this way, I'm conjuring like a flip in perspective. And so our identities, as thinker Neil Averndon from the book The Natural Alien, he says we are not in an environmental crisis, but we are the environmental crisis. And so what this phrase means is that our ideologies or our worldviews, so who we think we are, is completely tied up with the world that we create. And so the material world that we manifest is completely intertwined with our identities. And so my argument is that moving outside of the skin encapsulated ego could help us, or would help us, be more ecologically, to help usher in a more ecologically sustainable world, which is imperative for the future of all life on Earth. And so, like Carol has already mentioned, this work was inspired with my time living in the wilderness. And so I'm going to contextualize the term by giving a little bit about my experience and then a history of the term. And then I'm going to go into the 4 levels that I propose. So the ecological self includes the biophysical self, or the biophysical ecological self, the psychological ecological self, the cultural ecological self, and then the spiritual. Okay, so as already mentioned, I lived in the Idaho wilderness for 336 days. I wasn't born in Idaho. I was actually born in a town called Port Huron, Michigan. And it is, I lived 5 minutes away from Lake Huron. And so Ontario was my neighbor. So I appreciate everyone who's here from Ontario and Canada, because I find that as one of my favorite ecofeminists told me, the earth knows no boundaries. So in that way, it's a very fun. So in any case, so my time in the Idaho wilderness, in a sense, my began to merge with the natural world. So what I felt, there was no distinguishing factor between who I am and who the natural world was. Or it's more of like this clear-cut dualistic sense of self and other was, it softened. And so Florence Williams actually has a book called The 3-Day Effect. And she talks about how neurologically nature has, it changes your neurological frameworks or your neurological connections, spending time in nature. And specifically, she noticed that it was 3 days when this began to happen. And so what I had experienced phenomenologically living in the desert, she has done neurological or neuropsychological research to support this claim. And so another way to think about this, I'm not going to go into this, but the Buddhist sense of self, I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with Buddhism, but they have this concept that the self is habits. So it's kind of fluent in that sense. So the second event that helped me develop this framework is I was face-to-face with a copperhead snake one time when I was out on trail doing wilderness therapy. And so it was in this moment that my normal sense of who I was just kind of like fell to the wayside, because being face to face with this copperhead snake, I could tell that what constituted me was the same thing that constituted it, and that my actions were not ego-centered, but it kind of awoke in the more instinctual sense of who I was. And so, as Carol mentioned, I wrote about this, and it's published in a chapter called Doing Theology with Snakes, Face to Face with the Holy Other. And I use the word holy other because it was a spiritual experience. And so this is in the book Encountering Earth, Thinking Theologically with a More Than Human World. And so I'm going to read a little excerpt from that, because I think it gives a sense of what it was that happened. So I say, it felt like there was no me and there was no snake. There was simply this moment, this event, the there-ness of it all. There was no decider, only decision. There was no thinking, only thought. There was no space for thought to wander, to think, to swing back and forth as the grasping monkey mind does. Decision was made within a space-time that was merged. Space and time in this moment were more continuous than in ordinary life. decision was closer to instinct, but even this word does not relay the truth of the experience. So in this way, I had realized the always alreadiness of the ecological self. So humans, about 12,000 years ago, when with the rise of agriculture, we began to separate ourselves from the natural world. And so when we began to use the natural world and hoard our food and save, it's almost like we divided human from the natural world, civilization from wild. Our time was also different, so we began to use a very rigid sense of time rather than being connected with the rhythms of the land. Obviously, you know, we're still connected to seasons with agriculture, but even these days with the massive scale that agriculture has become, we've grown much more separated from the natural world. So in this moment when I was face to face with the snake, I realized how interconnected everything was, but the time scales that we exist in were very different. Okay, so also in that, I realized that the ego as this sort of construct is where most humans identify in. And that's because it's like the loudest voice in our psyches. It's the job of the ego is to always consider itself as being in control. And so it gives us this illusion of who we are. And it's a very closed and a small sense of who we are. So I'm not sure if you have heard, I'm sure some of you have heard of the field of ecofeminism. And so I gain allyship with one of my favorite theorists. Her name is Val Plumwood, and she's an Australian ecofeminist. And she has this essay called Being Prey, and it's where she was actually, and she had a near-death encounter with a crocodile. And it was in this moment when she had almost died that she realized kind of a similar thing that I realized, that humans identify with their egoic self, but actually there's a lot more going on. She calls it the narrative self. So it's these stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And so what I'm proposing is that these stories are currently very limited. There's a lot more going on. Okay, so that was a little bit of the context of the history of me and how I came to this term. But I want to contextualize it a little bit bigger, or a little bit more historically. So I'm not the first one to use this term. Arnie Ness, who was huge in the field of deep ecology, developed this term. It was also later used by Warwick Fox, Freya Matthews. Val Plumwood actually used it as well. And so, as I mentioned, Arnie Ness developed the field of deep ecology. And so his goal in using the term is to try to move from an egoic self to an ecological self. And as I've demonstrated, that's what I'm doing as well. And so for Arnie Ness, he was trying to develop a more empathetic response to the natural world, for humans to the natural world. He actually was inspired with this term when he had a flea. He was doing like a scientific experiment, and a flea landed in his petri dish, and he felt so much empathy with this flea, and so that inspired his concept. So for Ness, he had a more pragmatic sense of the term. He was using it in a very pragmatic sense, and so an example of this is the theorist John Seed, when he says, "I am part of the rainforest protecting itself." That's what John Seed was demonstrating with the ecological self. And so in that way, there's a sense of empathy. But later on, so Val Plumwood, the ecofeminist, she actually critiqued the deep ecology sense of the ecological self, because she says that actually what they're doing is having an unchecked ego, extending it onto the natural world. And in this way, it still maintains this sense of colonization, or like this over-identification with the natural world. Actually, the natural world and the wild are very different from who we are, and we have to maintain that sense of separation. And so what Val Plumwood offers, and I agree on this, is a sense of continuity with difference with the natural world. So maintaining both of those tensions. So one of my favorite examples of why continuity with difference is important when developing a sense of ecological self is in the film Grizzly Man. I don't know if you've all seen that. If you haven't, you should. It's a fantastic film. So it's a Werner Herzog film, and the main character, Timothy Treadwell, so he believed that he had bridged the gap between humans and bears. And so he lived with the bears, and he became friends with the bears. And I don't want to ruin the end, but the bears ended up turning on him in the end. And so it was pretty messy. And it demonstrates a really important point that we can't just say, oh, you know, humans developing an ecological self, that we're continuous at the natural world. There are actually some very dangerous forces out there that we need to respect. One example is recently I had a very, very, very bad case of poison oak, and so I was terribly and solely reminded of this point. So another good example comes from the film Into the Wild. That's probably my favorite film of all time. And so Alexander Supertramp, he goes into the wild to kind of like find himself. And once again, an encounter with a plant, the wild ends up turning on him. And so it's just a really important reminder that the wild is other, the wild demands respect, as well as us remembering that we are interconnected with the wild. So that's about the context, where I came to the term, and then a history of the term. And so now I'm going to move into developing the term. And so I mentioned there are 4 levels. So the biophysical, the psychological, the cultural, and the spiritual. And recall that I like to use the word porous or permeable. And okay, so the biophysical self, if we think of the membrane, as I already mentioned, so the sense of self and other is not so dualistic or separate. There's communication happening. So the psychological self, there's a lot of research coming out that says human psychological health is actually quite tied to the natural world. And so we can't ignore this fact. As far as the cultural self goes, a lot of research coming out, especially from the field cognitive ethology, we're starting to realize that there is culture in nature. And so culture is not just a human thing, but the more research we do, the more we realize that the natural world has politics and morals, ethics. Animals have intelligence, language, they have emotions. We just haven't really focused on this, historically. And so then the spiritual component of the ecological self is that there is an ineffable quality to experiences in nature. I'm sure many of you have had these when you're outdoors and there's that sense of awe or wonder. So that's kind of what I'm demonstrating with the spiritual side of the ecological self. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into each one of those. So the biophysical self, thinking about how humans as organisms, our biology is intertwined with the natural world. So humans are literally made up of non-humans. Our bodies actually contain more non-human cells than human cells. So it's actually over 50% of our human bodies are made up of non-human cells, specifically like bacteria and the human microbiome. And so one thing I like to think about is, I'm sure you've heard the term stomach mind. And so when you people say, oh, if you can't make a decision, just go with your gut. Well, your gut is actually made up of bacteria, and there's research done that says the healthier that your gut is, the healthier that your mind is, right? So there's this gut-mind connection that are radically intertwined. And So as I mentioned, not only we have our bodies are colonized with bacteria, we also come from the natural world. And so I mentioned the work of Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, specifically in their co-written book, The Universe Story. And then Brian Thomas Swim actually wrote and filmed an Emmy award-winning film, Journey of the Universe, which I highly recommend. It demonstrates how humans actually emerge not only from the natural world, but from the Big Bang itself. And so it goes Big Bang, and then there was the development of stars, which is kind of like the components of the first carbon-based life forms. Out of stars came planets, and then Earth developed the first one-celled organisms, and then the one-celled organisms became two-celled, and then you've got, you know, your multicellular bacteria, and then worms, fish, birds, you know, so on and so forth, all the way up to primates and then humans. And so not only do we have ancestral connection with the natural world and all the way to the Big Bang, but we actually have a lot of Earth beings to thank for these evolutionary achievements that they have created. So one example is the worm developed the nervous system that humans actually use in our bodies. And so, you know, we can bow our heads and thank worms, because if it weren't for worms, then we wouldn't have feelings and emotions, and our brains wouldn't work. And the water-based eye actually comes from fish. Fish were the first ones to evolve the, you know how bugs have like those very, I'm not sure what they're made out of, but it's a very different kind of eye, the water-based eye. And so that's the ones that humans use. Lizards actually developed the evolutionary achievement from fish scales to skin. So our human skin comes from that. We can thank the lizards for that as well. Lizards also were the first creatures to carry their young inside, and so it went how fish kind of like lay their eggs and fertilize on the outside of them. But there's a question. Can you say where we could learn about these? Yeah. So Brian Thomas Swim and Thomas Berry. I can actually write it in the chat later so that you have the reference. I'll do that later. Okay, thanks for your question. And so, yeah, so they went from carrying their young to the outside of their body to carrying it on the inside. Turtles we can thank for the 3-chambered heart to the 4-chambered heart, which is actually what humans have. And then actually my favorite story of all time comes from The Universe Story. And it is the development of the first symbiotic relationship. And so that's when prokaryotes evolved into eukaryotes. So the one-celled organisms evolved into the 2-celled organisms. It was actually because they were facing an oxygen crisis, which is not too different from what humans are currently facing. So right now, you know, we're facing climate change, and that's because there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This actually happened a long time ago with the movement from the prokaryotes to the eukaryotes. And so gaining inspiration from our ancestors, these one-celled organisms, you know, we can figure out a way to survive into the future. It just will call from us like an evolutionary development and achievement. And so with the prokaryotes, they were actually too successful of a species, which is what, you know, humans are facing as well. And so they were developing too much. There were too many of them. They overpopulated the earth. And so they were breathing out too much carbon dioxide, and they were burning up. And so what they ended up doing was they actually ate each other. And so, but instead of digesting one another, they got indigestion. And so in that way, they were carrying one inside of the other, which is how the one-celled organism moved from one-celled to two-celled organism. So in that, that was the achievement of the first symbiotic relationship. So we can thank them, because if there weren't for two-celled organisms, we wouldn't have multicellular organisms, and then we wouldn't have evolved to be the complex species that we are. So with Brian Swim, he also brings up that it's not just life that we are connected to, but all of life can be traced back to the Big Bang, and I've already mentioned that. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the psychological component of the ecological self. And I've already mentioned that human psychology is tied with the natural world. And there's a lot of mind and brain studies that are demonstrating this. There is a bacterium in the soil called Mycobacterium vacci, and it has been shown that inhaling this actually boosts serotonin and reduces anxiety. Many of you probably know the work of Richard Louv. He's done really important work. He coined the term nature deficit disorder, saying that because children aren't going outside, that that's actually causing a lot of mental problems. Mental health is kind of going down because kids and humans aren't going outside, or adults aren't going outside. So it has been shown that being outside actually enhances memory and learning. So inhaling this Mycobacterium vacci is connected to that. There's also studies that show that being outside reduces ADHD symptoms. I'm sure you've heard of the Japanese practice of forest bathing. There was a study that revealed that stress levels in forest bathers were reduced by 13.5% after being outdoors. There was also a study done in a hospital in Pennsylvania where a room with a view actually helped patients heal faster, and so they had fewer negative comments on to their nurses, and they also required less medication. So this kind of demonstrates that there's a feedback loop between our psychology and our neuropsychological pathways and the natural world. So now I'm going to move on to the cultural ecological self. And so culture is considered as being rituals and symbols, politics, codes, language, emotions, intelligence. And so for a long time, scientists were trying to answer the question, what makes us human? What makes humans different from the natural world? And for a while, they were saying, oh, it was tool use. But then the work of primatologist Jane Goodall, she actually changed this by showing that chimps actually use tools to, she saw a chimp put a stick in a hole to get ants. And so then she said, oh, actually, you know, chimps use tools, so that doesn't make humans separate from the natural world. For a long time, people were saying that language separates humans from the natural world, but actually the more research that's been done on cognitive ethology shows that nature actually, the natural world is full of communication. And so specifically the work of Mark Bekoff, he has been huge in the field of cognitive ethology. So he's shown that elephants grieve just like humans grieve. Actually recently there was a orca in Puget Sound that was pushing her dead baby calf for about 1,000 miles until she finally gave up. And so this was a way, this demonstrates that, you know, this was her ritual. She was mourning her young. Animals do have feelings. It's not just a human-centric thing. That actually comes from philosophers a long time ago, like Descartes and Francis Bacon, who have given us the sense that humans are the only people or the only beings that think and that feel. Actually, also, dolphins have recently gained the status of personhood in India. So it's very slowly starting to emerge, but this type of thinking is happening. So a few people who are helping with this, anthropologist Eduardo Cohn has a book called How Forests Think. And so he's showing that forests actually do think. It's just not just because they don't have brains doesn't mean they don't think. They actually communicate using pheromones. There's a concept called tree crowning. And so what happens is that trees will grow together, but then when they kind of touch each other, they'll back off And so that's why when you look up at a forest, it's almost like there's a sense of respect in the canopy, because the forest actually kind of respects space of other trees. Actually, Peter Wollben, he has a book called The Hidden Life of Trees, and so he kind of goes over this research as well. I've already mentioned the work of Jane Goodall, a primatologist. One of her research assistants, Barbara Smuts, I actually took a few classes with her in my undergrad, and Barbara Smuts has this article called The Creation of Patriarchy, and she's demonstrating how she lived with bonobos in the natural world, and she's demonstrating how, because the male bonobos are bigger and then they wanted to mate more with the females, that's how patriarchy, that's like one of the early forms of patriarchy, because women would start, or the female bonobos would start to bond together as a way to ward off the male bonobos. Naturalist John Young has a great book called What the Robin Knows, and so he's developed a way of demonstrating how bird language happens and how birds communicate to one another. So yeah, I've already talked about how it's hard for us to see this because humans have separated themselves from the natural world, and then that began with the rise of agriculture. And so finally, I'm going to talk about the spiritual component of the ecological self. I've mentioned that there's just this ineffable quality that many of you experience if you've gone to Yosemite and you just feel so small, or sometimes when you're by a waterfall and or you'll see a sunset, everything just kind of falls away, or you feel interconnected with the natural world. That's kind of what I'm trying to conjure up. And so this spiritual quality, it resists categorization with the mind, which is why it feels so spiritual. Like, we can't understand it, but it's this subjective experience with the natural world. And so you can see this, obviously modern humans have to be very careful, because indigenous people who have been living close to the land have a much more developed sense of interconnection with the natural world. Also, so I mentioned how cognitive mythology is showing that language is in the natural world, but I know I have some colleagues who are working on interspecies communication, and so kind of developing one sense of spirituality and heightened sense of awareness to communicate with the natural world. And so in this way, seeing the natural world as a thou rather than an it, that's one way to develop this sensibility. And so it's kind of like, like if you do yoga and you say namaste, that means, the God in me bows to the God in you. And so whether you believe in, God, like a Christian God, or a sense of the divine, but realizing that when you encounter another natural living being, that it's the same force that created you, that created, that plant or that cat or that dolphin. And so some ways to develop this sensibility would be to ask permission. And so I've worked with a few naturalists who, when they encounter, like they go to pick a flower and they ask permission. Or I know when I teach primitive fire making to my students, which is a very sacred skill, creating friction fire using a bow drill with sticks. I tell them how I harvest the materials. I go to the forest and I try to drop my own mind and connect with the natural world in that way. And so I'm constantly, asking permission and trying to maintain a sense of intimacy with the natural world, so I don't take too much, right? I want to make sure I'm taking materials without doing it in a colonizing sort of way. One practice that I try to do, although I'm not great at, I have this sense of an ecofeminist practice where when I encounter my cat, I think of her through an ecofeminist framework. And so she's so cute and she's so small, but she's actually a person. There's a person in there. And so I think, even though sometimes when I want to grab her and pick her up and snuggle her, I think, would I want someone to do that to me without, if I'd be walking around, if someone just grabs me. I don't actually like when people grab me. So I try to think about that when I am encountering my cats. So let's see. Actually, in the Catholic religion, they are starting to turn towards more awareness and embodying the natural world as being a spiritual place. So Pope Francis actually just released his encyclical Laudato Si, which goes over that a little bit, which is a big deal for the Catholic Church, actually. So that's about it. I have a short conclusion, and then I'm really looking forward to a little bit of discussion. So that I've gone over this concept of the ecological self, and currently, as we're facing this multifaceted ecological crisis, which includes the sixth mass extinction, which is something that people don't talk about. I think it's actually too big to realize that this could actually be happening right now. So the actual fifth mass extinction was the dinosaurs. And so right now the rate of species extinction is matching that. And so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, which is why it's so difficult to talk about this or to act upon this. So there's the sixth mass extinction. We also have ocean acidification, which is kind of tearing up the coral reefs. Climate change, so you can see this with all the wildfires and the superstorms that are getting worse every year. So deforestation and the degradation of the natural world through like fracking and resource exploitation. So in this multifaceted crisis, I urge that it is imperative that we develop the sensibility of our interconnection with the natural world. And so the ecological self not only looks to the past to learn from its mistakes, but it also looks towards the future, towards multiple generations. And so oftentimes I hear when people realize what's actually happening, like I said, it's too big. And so people say, oh, well, I have such a sense of hopelessness. And when you have a hopelessness, you tend to feel depressed. And then when you're depressed, it's hard to act. So it's a big deal right now. But I like Joanna Macy's term. She has a term, active hope. And so hope isn't just something, because when I hear people use the word hope, they say it feels like, oh, I have hope for the future. Well, actually, we can each do something every day, right? Even whether how big or how small that is. And so Joanna Macy also has this concept of the three pillars of the Great Turning. So these are ways that we can become involved in changing the world and being involved in working towards changing the ecological crisis. And so those are holding actions, structural change, and shifts in consciousness. So holding actions are like activism, working towards indigenous rights, like going vegan or changing your lights to solar, recycling. Structural change are like politics, like the Green New Deal or divestment in fossil fuels. And then shifts in consciousness are kind of like what we're doing now, like education and like realizing ecological selfhood. And so in this way, this crisis is like an all hands on deck situation. And so I've often gained energy and inspiration from Thomas Berry, who in his great work, he has a very good book called The Great Work that goes over what to do amidst this ecological crisis. And so I'll just end with a quote and then, looking forward to questions. So he says, "We must feel that we are supported by that same process that brought the earth into being, that power that spun the galaxies into space, that lit the sun and brought the moon into its orbit. those same forces are still present. Indeed, we might feel their impact at this time and understand that we are not isolated in the chill of space with the burden of the future upon us and without any aid of any other power. And so that's it. So thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.